Wisconsin is the 30th state of the United States, a place long associated with quiet industry, manufacturing, and a reputation built around stability rather than scandal. At its heart lies Milwaukee, the largest city in the state, and for decades, an economic center of the Midwest. From the late 1980s into the early 1990s, Milwaukee was repeatedly praised as a model American city. Few would have imagined that, beneath that surface, a pattern of disappearances was slowly taking shape. By the end of that period, more than a dozen men had vanished. They were not connected by profession or neighborhood, but they shared critical similarities. Most were young. Most were members of the gay community. Many were people whose lives placed them at the margins of public attention. Reports of missing persons accumulated quietly, case by case. Law enforcement suspected the possibility of a serial offender, yet the absence of clear evidence kept the theory from advancing. No witnesses, no recovered bodies, no definitive crime scenes. For years, the cases remained unresolved. Then, on a Monday night, everything changed. Late in the evening of July 22nd, 1991, two Milwaukee police officers were conducting a routine patrol near a residential building on North 25th Street. It was an ordinary shift, the kind that rarely makes headlines. As they approached the area, a man suddenly ran toward them from the direction of the apartment complex. He was visibly distressed. He was not wearing clothing. A metal handcuff was still fastened to his wrist. At first glance, the situation appeared confusing, even absurd. The officers briefly considered whether the man might be intoxicated or behaving erratically. Within seconds, however, his panic became unmistakable. He told them that someone inside the building had tried to kill him. What followed would become one of the most consequential moments in modern American criminal history. The man explained that earlier that night he had been at a bar where he met another individual who offered money in exchange for drinks and photographs. The arrangement did not seem unusual. He agreed and followed the man back to an apartment in the nearby building. Once inside, subtle details began to trouble him. There was an overpowering odor. Unfamiliar chemicals were visible. A sense of unease settled in. Before he could fully process it, he was restrained. He managed to escape only by exploiting a brief lapse in attention. When he ran, he did not look back. As the officers listened, they made a decision that would prove decisive. They accompanied him back to the apartment. The door opened without resistance. The man who answered was calm, cooperative, and unremarkable in appearance. He admitted to placing the handcuffs on his guest and claimed it was part of a consensual encounter. The key, he said, was inside the bedroom. The officers entered. What they saw next did not require interpretation. In plain view were photographs depicting extreme violence. The images were not staged props or fictional scenes. They were records, documentation, evidence. In that instant, the years of unanswered disappearances in Milwaukee converged into a single location. The routine patrol was over. A case that had eluded explanation for years had just exposed itself, and the city was about to learn how close it had been to a nightmare hiding in plain sight. The moment the apartment door opened, the case shifted from uncertainty to inevitability. The man who stood before the officers appeared calm. He was a white male, composed, cooperative, and notably unalarmed by the presence of law enforcement. When asked about the handcuff still attached to the wrist of the man standing behind them, he did not deny responsibility. He stated plainly that he had restrained his guest during a consensual encounter and that the key to the cuff was located in the bedroom. His tone was measured. There was no visible panic. Nothing in his demeanor suggested urgency or fear. That calm would not last. The officers entered the apartment cautiously. The layout was small and efficient, typical of the building. Near the entrance was a compact living area. Beyond it, a narrow hallway led toward the bedroom. Even before reaching the far end of the apartment, a strong and unfamiliar odor hung in the air. It was not immediately identifiable, but it was persistent enough to draw attention. When the officers stepped into the bedroom, the nature of the situation became unmistakable. Partially open drawers beside the bed revealed a series of photographs. They were not casual images or personal memorabilia. They depicted human bodies in various stages of dismemberment. The injuries were severe. The context was undeniable. These were not staged effects or fictional scenes. The officers later stated that at that moment, they knew they were looking at evidence of homicide. Their response was immediate. Both officers drew their weapons and ordered the man to lie on the floor. He complied without resistance. Backup units were requested, and the apartment was secured. What had begun as a response to a single distressed individual had escalated into a full-scale crime scene. As additional officers arrived, a systematic search of the apartment began. In the kitchen area, the refrigerator was opened. Inside, officers found human remains. Among them was a severed human head, later identified as belonging to an African-American male. Other organs were also present, stored alongside ordinary household items. The discovery confirmed that the photographs were not isolated evidence, but part of an ongoing pattern. The man on the floor did not attempt to deny what was unfolding. According to reports, he made statements acknowledging responsibility, indicating that he understood the gravity of what had been found. His words did not attempt to justify his actions. They reflected resignation rather than shock. The apartment itself told the story more clearly than any confession could. Throughout the residence, officers located containers holding additional body parts. In total, they discovered 11 human skulls. Some had been cleaned and preserved. Others had been altered, treated, or painted. In a blue plastic barrel located in the bedroom, investigators found a corrosive liquid containing dissolved remains belonging to multiple victims. Additional skeletal remains were recovered from various locations within the apartment. Photographic evidence was extensive. Investigators recovered 74 photographs documenting the dismemberment of victims. Each image served as a record, capturing a process rather than a single moment. One forensic specialist later described the apartment not as a chaotic scene, but as something closer to a private laboratory. The level of organization suggested repetition and planning. By the early hours of the morning, the apartment was fully sealed. What had been uncovered was not one crime, but the remnants of many. As identification efforts began, the suspect's name was released. Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer. Born on May 21, 1960, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Dahmer had spent most of his life moving quietly through ordinary spaces. He had attended local schools. He had held various jobs. He had lived with family members and later alone. To neighbors, he was largely unremarkable. To law enforcement, until that night, he was not a priority. Yet the evidence now indicated that, over a span of more than a decade, Dahmer had killed multiple men. The victims varied in age, but many shared similar vulnerabilities. Several were immigrants. Some were people of color. Most were individuals whose disappearances did not immediately command sustained public attention. The arrest sent shockwaves through Milwaukee. News of the discoveries spread rapidly. Public reaction was immediate and intense. Questions surfaced about how such crimes could occur undetected for so long. Attention turned not only to Dahmer, but to the systems that had failed to stop him earlier. Reports emerged of prior encounters with law enforcement, missed warning signs, and complaints that had not been fully pursued. For the families of the victims, the arrest brought confirmation without comfort. Answers arrived, but too late to prevent loss. For investigators, the challenge had only begun. The scope of the crimes required extensive forensic analysis, victim identification, and legal preparation. Each set of remains represented a life that had to be reconstructed through records, testimony, and painstaking examination. The process would take months. As Jeffrey Dahmer was led away from the apartment, the building behind him stood silent. What had once appeared to be an ordinary residence was now recognized as the center of one of the most disturbing criminal cases in American history. Yet the question that lingered was not only how he was caught. It was how he had managed to operate for so long without intervention. To understand that, investigators and the public would have to look backward, beyond the night of his arrest, into the years that shaped him and the choices that went unchallenged along the way. To understand how Jeffrey Dahmer was able to kill for years without being stopped, investigators were forced to examine not only his crimes, but the long path that led to them. Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer was born on May 21, 1960, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. His father, Lionel Dahmer, was a doctoral student in chemistry who later worked as a research chemist. His mother, Joyce Dahmer, struggled with severe depression following childbirth. From an early age, the household was marked by emotional instability. His mother was frequently bedridden. His father was often absent due to academic and professional demands. As a result, Jeffrey grew up largely unattended during critical developmental years. As a child, he was described as quiet, compliant, and withdrawn. He did not exhibit outward aggression, nor did he display behaviors that immediately alarmed adults around him. However, his emotional isolation deepened as family conflict intensified. Arguments between his parents were frequent and volatile, unfolding openly in front of him. Over time, this environment normalized emotional chaos and distance rather than security. At the age of 4, Dahmer underwent surgery for a hernia. Family members later noted that following the procedure, he became more introverted and reluctant to engage socially. Whether this change was related to the surgery itself or to the broader environment remains unclear, but it marked a noticeable shift. Around the same period, Dahmer developed an intense interest in animal remains. His father, a chemist, once demonstrated how animal bones could be cleaned and preserved using chemical solutions. The lesson was intended as a harmless educational moment. For Jeffrey, it became something else entirely. He began collecting dead animals found along roadsides and in wooded areas. He learned how to strip flesh from bone, how to bleach skeletal remains, and how to store them. These activities were conducted in isolation, often hidden from others. What might have appeared as curiosity gradually evolved into fixation. Control over lifeless forms offered him a sense of order that his home life lacked. By adolescence, Dahmer's sense of detachment had intensified. In high school, he struggled socially and academically. He had few friends and little interest in typical peer relationships. He began drinking alcohol regularly while still a teenager, often bringing it to school concealed in containers. Teachers and classmates noticed his behavior, but he was often dismissed as eccentric rather than dangerous. During this time, his inner fantasies grew more disturbing. Dahmer later stated that he was not interested in mutual relationships. He wanted complete control. He imagined possessing another person who would never leave, resist, or reject him. These thoughts did not immediately translate into action, but they shaped his worldview. Intimacy in his mind became inseparable from domination. In 1978, Just weeks after graduating from high school, Dahmer committed his first murder. He encountered a young man who accepted a ride to his home. The evening began with drinking and conversation. When the man prepared to leave, Dahmer attacked him, striking him and ultimately killing him. The act was impulsive, unplanned, and driven by panic at the thought of abandonment. In the aftermath, Dahmer dismembered the body and attempted to dispose of the remains using methods he had practiced on animals. This crime was never discovered at the time. Instead of triggering immediate consequences, it marked the beginning of a pattern that would resurface repeatedly. In the years that followed, Dahmer's life drifted without direction. He briefly attended college but dropped out after only a few months. At his father's urging, he enlisted in the United States Army, where he trained as a medical specialist. Even within the structured environment of the military, his alcohol abuse and behavioral issues persisted. He was eventually discharged early, deemed unfit for service. Unwilling to return home and face his father's disappointment, Dahmer relocated to Florida, where he lived transiently and worked low-wage jobs. His isolation and drinking worsened. When his father eventually intervened and brought him back to the Midwest, there was hope that family oversight might stabilize him. It did not. Over the next several years, Dahmer moved between relatives, including a period living with his grandmother in Milwaukee. During this time, he attempted to present himself as compliant and improving. He attended church with her and held short-term employment. On the surface, he appeared to be regaining control. Behind that appearance, however, his fantasies intensified. He began frequenting gay bars and bathhouses, where anonymity was easy and encounters were brief. Initially, he relied on alcohol and sedatives to incapacitate partners so that they would remain still during sexual contact. The goal was not violence, but control. Yet each encounter reinforced the same dissatisfaction. Temporary submission was not enough. The escalation was gradual, but deliberate. Dahmer experimented with stronger substances. He began to imagine ways to render partners permanently passive. He fixated on the idea of preserving parts of the body, particularly skulls, as objects of permanence. These were not trophies in the traditional sense. They were symbols of ownership. Multiple arrests during this period should have served as intervention points. Dahmer was cited more than once for indecent exposure. Psychological evaluations identified personality disorders and impulse control issues. Despite these warnings, consequences were minimal. He was fined, placed on probation, and repeatedly returned to the community. Each missed opportunity reinforced the same outcome. By the late 1980s, Dahmer was living alone in Milwaukee. Free from family oversight and under limited supervision, his behavior escalated rapidly. What had once been fantasy and experimentation solidified into routine. By the time law enforcement would finally encounter him again, Jeffrey Dahmer was no longer improvising. He was refining, and the city around him had no idea what was unfolding behind a closed apartment door. By the late 1980s, Jeffrey Dahmer was no longer living under the watchful eye of family members. After repeated conflicts with relatives and concerns about his behavior, he moved into his own apartment on North 25th Street in Milwaukee. The change was significant. For the first time, he had privacy, autonomy, and minimal supervision. It was during this period that the frequency and severity of his crimes escalated. Dahmer relied on a consistent method. He met men in bars frequented by the local gay community and offered money in exchange for photographs or companionship. Once inside his apartment, he used alcohol and drugs to incapacitate them. The goal, as he would later explain, was control. When that control proved temporary, he resorted to lethal violence. Neighbors noticed unusual conditions almost immediately. Complaints were filed regarding foul odors emanating from his apartment. Some reported strange noises at night, including drilling sounds and prolonged disturbances. Each time concerns were raised, Dahmer provided explanations that were accepted without further inquiry. He attributed the smells to spoiled meat or plumbing issues. In a densely populated building with limited resources for enforcement, these explanations were rarely challenged. The most consequential failure occurred in May 1991. That night, residents contacted police after discovering a 14-year-old boy, Konarak Synthasamphone, naked, disoriented, and bleeding, wandering outside the apartment complex. 3 women who encountered him believed he was in immediate danger and refused to accept assurances that everything was fine. When officers arrived, Dahmer approached calmly and claimed the boy was his 19-year-old boyfriend who had simply consumed too much alcohol. Despite the visible injuries and the protests of witnesses, the officers accepted Dahmer's account. Emergency medical personnel expressed concern and recommended hospital treatment, but their suggestion was not pursued. The boy was returned to Dahmer's apartment. He did not survive the night. This incident would later become one of the most heavily scrutinized moments in the case. It exposed vulnerabilities within law enforcement decision-making at the time, including over-reliance on surface explanations, insufficient follow-up, and a failure to recognize signs of coercion. Broader social factors also played a role. Many of Dahmer's victims were young men of color or recent immigrants, groups whose safety concerns were often deprioritized in that era. While no single factor explains the failure, together they created conditions in which warnings were missed. 2 months later, the case finally collapsed under its own weight. The events of July 22, 1991, ended Dahmer's freedom and initiated a full-scale investigation. He was charged with multiple counts of first-degree murder. During interrogation, he admitted to killing numerous victims, though he claimed limited memory of some incidents. Prosecutors ultimately brought charges for 17 murders. Dahmer entered guilty pleas to 16 of them. The trial began in January 1992. The central legal question was not whether Dahmer had committed the acts, but whether he was legally responsible for them. His defense argued that he suffered from severe mental illness and was unable to control his behavior at the time of the crimes. Expert witnesses testified regarding personality disorders and compulsive behavior. The prosecution countered that Dahmer demonstrated clear planning, awareness, and concealment, all indicators of legal sanity. After months of testimony, the jury reached a unanimous verdict. Jeffrey Dahmer was found legally sane and guilty of multiple counts of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to 16 consecutive life terms in prison, totaling more than 900 years of incarceration. The sentence ensured that he would never be eligible for release. Dahmer was transferred to the Columbia Correctional Institution, a maximum security facility in Wisconsin. Initially, he was placed in isolation for his own protection. Over time, prison administrators allowed him to integrate into the general population and participate in work assignments. During this period, he requested access to religious texts and engaged in daily Bible study. He spoke publicly about his crimes in interviews, acknowledging responsibility while framing his actions as driven by internal compulsions he claimed he could not escape. On November 28, 1994, his incarceration came to an abrupt end. That morning, Dahmer was assigned to cleaning duties in a prison restroom alongside 2 other inmates. After approximately 20 minutes with no activity reported, correctional officers entered the area. They found Dahmer and another inmate severely injured, both lying on the floor with head trauma. Despite emergency medical intervention, Dahmer was pronounced dead approximately 1 hour later. The second inmate died 2 days afterward. The attacker, Christopher Scarver, later stated that he believed he was acting under divine instruction. He admitted to concealing a metal bar and striking both men while they were distracted. Dahmer did not resist. With his death, the legal proceedings surrounding Jeffrey Dahmer ended permanently. For the families of the victims, justice had come in the form of conviction, not closure. For the city of Milwaukee, the case prompted deep reflection on institutional responsibility and the cost of inaction. Policies were reviewed. Officers involved in earlier encounters faced disciplinary measures. Public trust had been damaged, and rebuilding it would take years. Jeffrey Dahmer's crimes did not occur in isolation. They unfolded within a system that repeatedly underestimated risk, misjudged credibility, and failed to protect the most vulnerable. His capture was the result of chance. His continued freedom was the result of missed opportunities. And that distinction remains one of the most enduring lessons of the case. The arrest and conviction of Jeffrey Dahmer brought an official end to one of the most disturbing criminal cases in American history. In legal terms, the outcome was definitive. He was found guilty, sentenced to spend the rest of his life in prison, and removed from society. By the standards of the justice system, the case was closed. Yet closure, in cases like this, is rarely absolute. For the families of the victims, answers arrived years too late. Names were confirmed. Remains were identified. The uncertainty that had haunted them was replaced by a different kind of pain, the knowledge of what their loved ones had endured and how long it had gone unnoticed. Justice provided accountability, but it could not restore what had been taken. For the city of Milwaukee, the case forced a reckoning. Jeffrey Dahmer did not operate in complete secrecy. There were warning signs. There were complaints. There were encounters with law enforcement that, in hindsight, demanded closer scrutiny. Decisions were made in moments of uncertainty, often under the pressure of routine, limited information, and social assumptions that shaped credibility and response. The consequences of those decisions were irreversible. This case exposed how easily danger can be underestimated when victims belong to communities that are marginalized, overlooked, or misunderstood. Many of Dahmer's victims were young men who lived on the edges of public concern. Their disappearances did not immediately generate urgency. Their voices were not heard until one of them managed to escape. That escape changed everything. It demonstrated how fragile the line between prevention and catastrophe can be. Had that moment unfolded differently, the crimes might have continued even longer. The fact that chance played such a significant role in stopping them remains one of the most unsettling aspects of the case. Jeffrey Dahmer's death in prison did not erase the harm he caused, nor did it resolve the broader questions raised by his crimes. It ended his story, but it did not end the responsibility of institutions to examine their failures. In the years that followed, law enforcement agencies reviewed procedures, training, and oversight. These changes were necessary, but they came at a cost measured in lives. True crime is not about fascination with violence. At its core, it is about accountability, awareness, and remembrance. The story of Jeffrey Dahmer is not told to amplify his notoriety, but to honor the victims by acknowledging the full truth of what happened and why it was allowed to happen. When systems fail to act, individuals suffer. When warnings are ignored, tragedies multiply. And when justice arrives only after irreparable harm, society is left with lessons written in loss. The file on Jeffrey Dahmer is closed. The consequences of the failures surrounding it are not. And remembering that distinction is the only way to ensure that such a case remains a warning rather than a precedent.